Hi, I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
And this is the Climate Optimists. This week's show, we're planning to talk a little bit about climate impacts in agriculture. Not a simple topic, but one that needs to be discussed. You agree, Todd?
I do, and I definitely agree with the fact that it's not simple. And it hurt my simple brain.
I think I made the assumption because we both grew up on farms and farming communities that this would be an easy topic, and I think it's turned out to maybe be the hardest topic that we've done so far.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there on the climate science side of this thing.
And all the, interactions between different elements and how that impacts crops and benefits some and hurts others.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So we'll try to do it justice, but it might be ugly at points. So hang on. But before we go there, this week's reason for hope, and this truly is a reason for hope, Senate Democrats are in discussions about adding a carbon price to the $3.5 trillion infrastructure package. The current proposal is to have it start at $15 a ton and go up from there. I will say that $15 a ton is not sufficient, but,
Got to start somewhere.
Indeed. The goal would be, I think, to use the funds to pay for some of the programs being proposed with the infrastructure plan.
Nice.
It would apply to oil, natural gas, coal, all of it at the source, which would make it easier to administer. As part of that, too, they're also suggesting a repeal of all the fossil fuel subsidies.
They still have subsidies?
They still have subsidies. Shocking. But hopefully this proposal will fix that. The only thing I would say, given what we talk about here, is it would be nice if they could include a dividend of some sort for consumers to help kind of shield them from the price. $15 a ton, we're not going to notice, but as that climbs, that'll be a bigger deal.
Yeah, right.
And then the other thing that we've also talked about is the need for a border adjustment and the idea that, basically goods that are produced elsewhere that are, don't have rigorous climate policies in place would pay a fee at the border. So it helps level the playing field, but the real advantage, it helps put pressure on China and India and other big carbon markets.
Right. Well, that's awesome.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I hope that gets done. I hope there's political will and ability to make that happen.
Yeah, and we'll get into later in the episode how all of us can help try to get this across the finish line.
Excellent.
So as some may be aware, record droughts and heat have been hitting the western U.S. this year. It was the hottest July on the West Coast in the past 127 years. Might as well be all time. And right now, about 49% of California is in a extreme drought category. We're here in Oregon, and Oregon similarly has some areas that are in extreme drought. And having the heat sort of compounds the effect of that. So, it's been making the drought worse.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if you've heard much about the Klamath Falls situation, this drought situation that they're in. And of course, they have all these different, I don't know what to call them, stakeholders. So you've got some tribes, you've got agriculture, you've got the environmentalists, and they're all kind of like wanting this water. It's like an Old West movie down there, like somebody shut off somebody's water upstream or whatever, And I mean, it literally is kind of like that because they actually have shut the water off on certain years to agriculture entirely because they have to have that water for flows for the fish, which, as any irrigated land, if you don't have any water, that's crucial, right? So it's a really serious situation they're in there with this water scarcity problem. I think there's like 1,200 family farms there. It's just one of these situations that is going to only be made worse, by what we're going to talk about here in the episode.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. So I think it's important to call out that farmers have always faced, adverse weather and having to manage the weather. That's not a new thing.
Not at all. There's just luck of the draw in some of that. You know what I mean? It really is.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a gamble they go through every year. I think the important thing to realize is that climate change is going to just make that harder. I don't know what it was like where you grew up, but it seems like you're always having to think about those weather variables and trying to balance risk. And sometimes you win, sometimes you don't.
Yeah, definitely. And we had that experience a lot. Where I grew up, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's a desert. I think it's rated as a desert if you look at annual rainfall. So everything is based on stored water, from the reservoirs. So, we've experienced drought there, high temps. When you get in those situations, water starts to get scarce, and they start limiting what you're going to get that year, and it can be a real big problem. And I don't know what your situation was like.
Yeah, we were fortunate, I think, in being a little less dry. So I don't know what our sort of classification would be, but yeah, we have a mountain range that captures a lot of winter snowpack, and then we have the benefit of a couple reservoirs to capture that in the spring. But even still, I mean, we've had dry years, and it's only been getting worse. And so then farmers who've never had to deal with having a well or having to put in wells to be able to pump from that, and in areas where groundwater is maybe already strained, that becomes problematic too. So yeah, even in an area where I would say we don't suffer sort of chronic droughts, it was problematic.
Yeah, and even outside of drought and just extreme weather events at key times, high winds, a lot of water dumping down at once, can just really just screw everything up.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, it really can wreak havoc. There were years when I think we lost almost our entire potato crop when a hailstorm came through and knocked all the foliage off, or we had an early unexpected freeze that killed the potatoes before they'd had a chance to really size up, and so the yield was substantially lower. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not just drought and heat. It's all those variables, and the fact that even with best laid plans, you can find yourself in a situation where things get ugly.
Definitely.
So today what we're planning to explore are really the primary climate impacts facing farmers, kind of our perspective on those, and in turn what solutions are available to help them adapt. And then obviously how, as folks who are concerned about climate change, how can we help that farming community? So at a high level, we kind of touched on this maybe already a little bit, but the major projections for climate in the West are, higher temperatures. We're expected to see, at least in the Northwest, wetter winters, drier summers, more frequent heavy precipitation events. So, that series of storms that you might get in the spring, all of a sudden it's coming down in one storm and you're getting 1.5 inches instead of, having that be spread out over 5 different storms.
Right.
And then I know you'll get into this, but decreasing snowpack is another huge one. So all those things together are going to make it more challenging for farmers. And really, I would sort of classify the impacts in kind of 3 different categories. Best case, you see some reductions in crop yields, on bad years, but by and large, things are okay. If you get a extreme event like we just talked about, you can end up with crop failure, right? And in places like Klamath Falls, we mentioned, you may eventually find yourself in a situation where you can't grow crops there anymore altogether.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I think snowpack is going to be a huge problem here in the West. We just rely so much on stored water, which is usually dependent on snowpack. Snow itself kind of acts as its own reservoir, right? And so you want snow to melt at a certain duration at a certain time of the year so that you kind of fill the reservoir at a certain time of year, and you get water later into the summer when you need it, when it's hot and there is no rainfall. So I'm sure you can speak to that with your experience growing potatoes.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a potato sort of growing cycle, I mean, it's similar to a lot of plants. Like, you need water throughout the cycle, but as the potato plants get bigger, you need more water. And you're also hitting that point in the summer when temperatures are higher, so the water demand is higher. And so, yeah, having a situation where you don't have late season water or you have diminished late season water is really problematic.
Yeah, definitely. And, there's western snowpack is really projected to decrease at lower elevations, like in the Cascades, Sierra Nevada, for example. And that's really crucial because, I think a lot of people think of snowpack, they think of some tall mountain
Snow-covered
peak or something,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of lower elevation snowpack that a lot of these reservoirs rely on. And as you talked about earlier, when you talk about wetter winters, that might reflect in the annual numbers as you're getting the same precipitation as you did before. But if the temps are higher and it comes down as rain in the winter instead of snow, right, in those same areas where it used to come down as snow, that's not going to be helpful to you
No.
in these, reservoir situations for storage. So that's really crucial. If that water comes off earlier, it comes off too fast. If there's a high temp event early in the spring or earlier than normal, that's also a bad thing. And also, too, if you look at places like California where water's already stretched, we talked about Klamath Falls, but, California as well, Sacramento Valley, I mean, it's a huge ag region, and if you just want to understand the scale of it without looking at a bunch of numbers, just look at Google Maps and look at that valley and how huge it is. It's just massive, right? And right now, demand is already 3 times larger than what the Sacramento River's supplying and 16 times larger than what the San Joaquin River is supplying.
That's crazy.
So, I mean, the demand, they're already stretched. They're already in a bad spot. Lack of water, could and will mean that some areas, you might no longer be able to just grow crops there, or at least the same type of crops, which is a problem too. I mean, I think people are like, oh, well, if you can't grow this crop because it takes too much water or the temperature changed too much, just grow some other crop. But if you think about the scale of trying to change something like that, it's massive, where these communities in these areas have built up over, literally like 100 years or more in some cases to grow certain things. And they have all this infrastructure and distribution and storage and transportation and equipment and just all the skills to do these certain things.
Shifting
to
that
change
would be massive.
that. Yeah, I mean, it would be huge cost to do that.
Well, and you kind of hinted at that, but the other thing is just even learning curve. I mean,
yeah,
there are certainly crops that are simpler to grow. I mean, farmers would tell you that there's some that are require a lot more sophistication than others. But if you spent years figuring out all the nuances of a crop and now you have to switch over to something else, that's not a quick transition.
Yeah, it seems like a big lift.
So in addition to snowpack, I think the other major issue in terms of climate change for the West are going to be these extreme weather events. So, it's not to say that increasing temperature isn't going to make things harder, or, less summer water isn't going to make things harder, but it's those unexpected events that are really going to cause problems. So, high heat events can be especially devastating if they hit a crop at a particular time of year, like, thinking about right before you're getting ready to harvest, when a lot of the, whatever you're growing is sizing and getting to that point where a few weeks makes a big difference in yield. We just had recently here in the Northwest, folks that live here are very aware, a massive heat wave back in June that, that had impacts not only for us, but for farmers. I mean, there's a region in southeastern Washington where they call Walla Walla sweet onions.
Right.
And there was an 80% crop failure as a result of that heat wave. They were just in the midst of harvesting, but the heat literally baked the onions in the ground. And so they were only able to salvage about 20% of that.
Wow.
Which, yeah, you can bounce back, I think, occasionally from those things, but to try to do that year after year is going to become hugely problematic.
Definitely.
The other one that I think is more of an issue, or people associate more with like the East Coast or the Midwest, are high precipitation events. And, out here, I think it becomes problematic, maybe not so much in the case of erosion, but in the fact that your soil, unless it's really healthy soil and porous, isn't going to be able to absorb that big storm, where if it came over multiple events, you'd be able to soak it in. And so I think, to me, that's going to be a problematic piece when those events come through.
Right.
The other thing I think that we want to call out is just kind of the fact that higher temperatures can really compound the effects of drought. And I think we talked about this a little already, but drought unto itself is problematic. But if you add high temperature to that, your soils become more dehydrated. Plants demand more water. You get more evaporation when you're putting that water down. So it really is kind of a multiplier in terms of making those droughts worse. And I'm guessing, again, growing up in northeastern Oregon where you did, facing droughts and heat was kind of a common occurrence.
It is. I feel like there's a drought cycle there that, pretty much it feels like every 5 years or so there's big drought problems and water problems, and if you think about what would happen if those periods got extended, right, it could be really detrimental. And we also, obviously we deal with some pretty high heat there too.
Right.
And I think there's a projection that in Malheur County anyway, that climate change could cause there to be an average of like 38 days more over 90 degrees.
Wow.
In a summer, which that's a lot of days, right?
Yeah.
That's like over a month's worth of days over 90. Believe me, there's already a lot of days over 90 there, and days over 100 are just super common now. And I know there's certain crops that like heat,
Sure.
but there's a limit to that, right?
So again, it kind of feels like we're going down this dark path of doom and gloom and the world is over. The good news is, as always, there's solutions to help deal with what we're facing. And, in the case of agriculture, one of the most basic is trying to shift crop varieties. So moving from maybe wheat that, is good for what it is now to wheat that is more, drought tolerant or can handle that extra heat. Farmers can also really focus on creating soils that better capture and store water. And that really can be done in, one of two ways. First, reducing the amount of tillage you do. So basically how much you're turning over the dirt out in your field. In the case of a crop like wheat or like corn, it means that you're coming through and you're cutting and harvesting the crop. And then rather than turning over all the leftover stalks, you're leaving them there, as roots to give the soil structure, and then you're planting that next year right into the old field. And so by doing that, you're preserving water in the soil, and then you're also making it better equipped to capture water when that water comes down.
Right. Interesting story. I started out, when I entered college, I started out as an ag major. And you can probably see as evidence from this podcast of why I didn't make it. But really I did. I think I was going to go into ag ed, but I got into crops and soils class and like a animal genetics class, and I was like, I am out of this.
The brain was hurting, huh?
I mean, it wasn't that it was that hard. I just didn't care. And I realized that I didn't.
It wasn't for you.
It wasn't for me, and I just wanted to, I ended up being a theater major. So I mean, that's kind of a wide.
It's a big shift.
It's a big shift right there. Yeah, for sure.
I guess it's probably fortunate for the theater community and maybe also fortunate for the ag community.
I don't know. I wouldn't speak for the theater community either.
So, yeah, when creating healthier soils and soils that are more porous, the first piece is really reducing tillage. The second is implementing a technique called cover crops, where, you might have your primary crop that you harvest, and then there's going to be a time period before you would typically plant your next crop. Putting in a temporary crop like, for instance, like clover, to help add some nutrients back to the soil, avoid, bare dirt that, can be eroded away.
Yeah.
And it's another way that just kind of adds organic matter and makes the soils more spongy and able to capture water.
Definitely. Another major solution, obviously, is kind of altering water infrastructure and how we use water to make it more efficient. And, the obvious one is converting to sprinklers. I'm sure people driving down the freeways have seen, a lot of sprinklers. You see them going out there.
Yep.
But in a lot of cases, what you didn't see before is that they possibly watered with cement ditches or dirt ditches and open ditches where you're just basically flooding the landscape. So obviously converting to sprinklers is much more efficient. Also, there's a lot of use of, well, maybe not a lot, but there's starting to be a lot of use of drip irrigation now, which you might be more familiar with, like in your garden. You hook these drip lines up to a faucet, and but they're using this stuff in large scale now, which also does a really great job of getting the water to where it needs to be. Obviously the goal is limiting evaporation and putting water, just the right amount of water where it's needed.
Right.
And when you're flood irrigating, you're just basically saturating the top of the field. Bottom of the field might not get as much water, or the worst too is that you just run so much water, you just run it over the top of it, right? You deal with erosion, you're running a lot of water off the bottom end of the field that just goes into a pond or goes back into the canal system.
Right.
So there's definitely a lot of benefits to using sprinklers, and there's programs out there, and soil water conservation entities are helping farmers with grants and subsidies and stuff to kind of afford to be able to make these conversions. So that's definitely one way of doing it. Of course, storage as well, that's going to be probably a consequence of some of what we're talking about, is that there might be a need to add more reservoirs,
right,
and more reservoir storage somehow.
If we're losing the snow as our reservoir, we need to find a way to replace that.
Which, and obviously, you'll be talking to about rivers next week. That has impact too, right? I mean, that has obvious impact if you're changing the landscape, you're changing the natural flow of things, and so we don't want to have to do that, right? Unless we absolutely have to, and it won't be cheap. In my region, the Owyhee Reservoir is really the only reason why a lot of the region I grew up, I think, is there. It provides water for 118,000 acres.
Wow.
Like over 1,800 family farms. And so it's just a big operation, and it's cool. I mean, my family's had a lot of involvement with that place. A lot of my family's worked for that irrigation district there. My dad has, in his kind of second career, had an uncle that worked there. My grandfather worked at the dam for 20 years. And I remember as a kid, just going up there and running around with him and the generators and the dam, and it felt pretty cool, It was like a unique experience for sure.
They were never out there with flak jackets and firearms, were they, to protect the water from being taken?
No, it's it's a pretty concrete system. It'd be really hard to steal water, because basically there's the water they're putting down the river, and then there's this underground gatehouse that you have to go down all these spiral stairs built in the 30s, go down there, turn on the gates to let water down.
So as always, there are policies that can be helpful in, instituting certain solutions. And while crop insurance is something that exists today, having more robust crop insurance programs to protect farmers is going to be essential. There are already incentives out there to help encourage, adopting sustainable practices like we've talked about, but we need to be able to adopt those practices more quickly. So, revisiting the size of the subsidies in the program, I think, is important. And then the other piece of this is really making sure that farmers have the technical resources they need in terms of adopting what might be new practices. Farmers are busy enough with their day job, and trying to get a farmer to sit down and have time to, do this kind of research on their own could be a real challenge. I think we should probably caveat that while we may sound like we really know what we're talking about, that we wanted to cover a subset of solutions that exist. There are others, and it's also important to remember that not every solution is one size fits all, and it's going to depend on where you are, what makes sense. And lastly, the biggest thing arguably all of us can do is really working on curbing our carbon emissions as quickly as possible, because when you look at the climate projections which we have, you can see there are potentially two very different scenarios that are going to be facing farmers. And while it's going to be a challenge regardless, if we're able to cut quickly, it can make a huge difference in the long run.
Yeah, agreed.
So what can we do? The most important, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of the different climate scenarios that farmers might be facing, is mitigating climate change. So while there are many solutions out there to help farmers adapt, the biggest thing I think all of us can do is help with cutting emissions and getting us to net zero as quickly as possible. We need to encourage President Biden's support carbon pricing as part of this infrastructure plan. We'll have resources on our website to help you do that, but this is a huge opportunity and carbon price in place. The other thing that you can do if you're looking specifically at agriculture is donating to a nonprofit. There are a lot of nonprofits out there, and I think it's just important to do your homework. So one organization that we feel does a great job is the Environmental Defense Fund. Their scope of services is huge, but they do have a large team working on water initiatives in the West. The goals of those are really, reversing groundwater depletion, getting water markets sorted out, rewarding good practices, and they have work that's focused on California Central Valley, like we were talking about, and as well as the Colorado River. So consider a donation to Environmental Defense Fund if you want to help out with some of those water-related initiatives. So that was a lot, huh? I feel like it was almost just like a filibuster for the last 25 minutes.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean,
we were I felt like we were going. It was all right.
Yeah, well, I guess for our audience, hopefully this was informative. We tried to pack a lot of information in here, maybe got a little bit too ambitious in what we wanted to cover. But, I think the takeaway message is that agriculture is going to have a rough road ahead. There are things that exist to help them in the face of climate change. And in my mind, while there are a lot of solutions to help them adapt, we need to continue to focus on the real elephant in the room, which is mitigating climate impacts, because that's arguably the biggest thing we could do to support them. So as always, thanks for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by the Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimists.co. That's climateoptimists.co. Follow us on social at Climate Stewards Collective.